Hello, my name is Matt Anderson. I'm the Curator of History here at the Sioux City Public Museum, and today we're going to talk about the women's suffrage campaign in Sioux City specifically, but also the national movement. We'll provide some context with how that got started, as well as the state of Iowa and the role that Sioux City played in the suffrage campaign here in Iowa. And since this is the 100th anniversary of the passage of the 19th Amendment to the Constitution that enfranchised women in August of 1920, so today is the day, the 18th of October that I'm recording this, that Tennessee became the 36th state to ratify the amendment. But without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. First of all, we have to set some context. So up until 1840 or so, women had very restricted rights under both American and British common law from which it was derived. Going clear back to the Normans almost 1,000 years ago, women were, especially married women, were considered to be one person with their husbands under a doctrine called coverture. And in that doctrine, women could not own property or control property outside of their husbands. And that was true until about 1840, both in Britain and the United States. And I have a esteemed jurist here, Sir William Blackstone, that defined the doctrine of coverture back in 1765. And he said, "By marriage, the husband and wife are one person in law. That is, the very being or legal existence of the woman is suspended during the marriage." Now, unmarried women had more rights. They could own and control their own property, but generally property, if there was any other choice, went to male heirs of some type, and women were kind of left out of that, if at all possible. And needless to say, women had very few voting rights prior to the 1840s. Now, there are a couple of examples in early American history, even in colonial American history, of women getting to vote. And the first one in the colonial period was that of Lydia Taft, who was a wealthy widow from Uxbridge, Massachusetts. In 1756, during the French and Indian War, she was allowed to vote in the town meeting there on a property tax that would pay troops to help defend the town from French and Indian troops. So in that case, working in conjunction with the British Army. And so that's the one for sure case that a woman voted in colonial America that historians have uncovered. The other exception is the New Jersey Constitution of 1776. Now, of the 13 original states, 12 of them adopted constitutions that specifically enfranchised men of some property. There was a certain set amount of property, say 50 pounds worth of property at the time, still in British currency, and that was true for of all the early constitutions except for New Jersey. Now, New Jersey had a property qualification for the vote, but it didn't specify that it had to be a male property owner. And in 1790, it was actually amended to allow women of property to vote. And then in 1807, it was amended again to specifically exclude women no matter what. And so between 1807 and 1839, American women could not vote at any level of government in the United States. Now, the United States Constitution, as it was originally adopted in 1789, really says very little about voter qualifications. For one thing, in the Constitution, the only directly elected body in the U.S. government is the U.S. House of Representatives. And for that, the Constitution leaves voter qualifications up to the individual states. So there's no specifying there. It gave states complete control. Until 1913, the U.S. Senate was not a directly elected body. The various state legislatures elected the 2 state senators for each state, until that was changed by a constitutional amendment. And of course, the U.S. president is still indirectly voted through the Electoral College. So the president is when you vote for president, you're actually voting for electoral votes in the state that you're voting in. And so to give some context, there was by no means universal male suffrage in the early United States, and in fact anywhere else in the world. When George Washington was elected as the first president in the fall of 1788, about 30% of adult white men were eligible to vote due to the various property qualifications that the new states had. So not even all adult white men could. For the most part, black men, because any free black men usually couldn't vote because they didn't own enough property. And later, a lot of the state laws were adjusted so that it was white men that were specifically enfranchised, as we'll see when we get to the original voting laws in the state of Iowa. Now, all through the early 1800s, those property qualifications fell away. So as each state was added to the original 13, the new constitutions that were written for them tended to not have those property qualifications. Occasionally the property qualification was replaced by a tax, but for the most part that was not. The general trend was toward universal white male suffrage. And so by the election of 1840, which pitted William Henry Harrison against the incumbent president, Martin Van Buren, 90% of adult white men were eligible to vote. And so there was almost, by 1840, there was almost universal white male suffrage, which really, at this point, for instance, in Great Britain, which was the next most democratic, if you will, system in the world, maybe something like 30%. They were still at about where the United States started at back in 1788. So the U.S. was a world leader in that way, but it came at the expense of pretty much barring women from voting and gradually excluding black men from voting as well. Now, the early suffrage leaders almost all came from the abolitionist movement. And the abolitionist movement was the anti-slavery movement. It kind of got its start in the 1820s. It was always there to some extent, but it became a force in the 1830s. And there were quite a few women that were prominent in the abolitionist movement. And became leaders, and almost all of the early suffragist women and men, for that matter, came from the abolitionist movement. And so we have here in this slide we have a little booklet, or it's actually a collection box for the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society. So that gives you an idea of what we're dealing with here. So this is before the Civil War, and it was in the 1830s that abolitionist women were amongst the first American women to speak to mixed crowds of women and men. It was considered quite unseemly for women to speak to mixed audiences in the 1830s, and indeed until after the American Civil War. And here we have two of the earliest female abolitionist speakers, the Grimke sisters. And Sarah and Angelina, they were actually daughters of a prominent slaveholder who became abolitionists in their adult years. And Sarah Grimke, the older of the two, in 1838 wrote an important tract in which she compared the situation for American women to that of African Americans that were enslaved, and how essentially white men used the law to elevate themselves at the expense of women and blacks in the United States. And then her sister, Angelina, was the first woman in U.S. history to speak before a state legislature. In 1838, she spoke against slavery before the Massachusetts state legislature. So they were very important, and they were amongst the first suffragists in American history. Now, interestingly enough, a couple of the early state laws that began to change the status of women in America occurred in the South, but actually in what at that time was really the Western United States. And so the first one is in Kentucky. And in 1838, the Kentucky legislature passed a law that allowed female heads of household to vote in elections on tax levies and for members of county school boards. So basically, women who, essentially widowed women who had families or were single, could vote in these local elections. And keep in mind, this set a trend then that we'll see throughout the suffrage era, in which the westernmost states tended to be the most open to suffrage. And there's various theories for that. Some of it is there was a less entrenched power network, especially within the political parties. You didn't have the political machines yet in the less settled areas, and also just basically the smaller populations led to a kind of a less settled existence, and women played more of a day-to-day role in actually keeping the society going, maybe than in the more settled areas. And so there are various theories of why the western states tended to lead in improving the situation of women, but they pretty consistently did. Now, the second landmark law change came in Mississippi the very next year. In 1839, the Mississippi legislature passed a Married Women's Property Act. And it was the first law in the United States that allowed women to own property in their own name without their husband's name being attached to it. But the control of the property, so if it brought any rent, or if she wanted to sell it, that had to go through her husband. And so married women were allowed to own their own property, but they weren't allowed to control it. And this started a trend of states passing a lot of similar acts. And most historians agree that this was to improve the economic security of a family if they lost the husband or father, that they wouldn't fall into paupery as a result. And so that was probably why this change happened, but it was a significant, if somewhat minor, improvement in the status, particularly for married women in the United States. Now, New York, because it was the most populous state, in the 19th century and through most of American history, tended to be really set precedents. And so New York in 1848, the New York State Legislature passed their version of the Married Women's Property Act. And what was significant about this was that it allowed married women to own and control their own property independently of their husbands. And so that one became then the model for most states thereafter that passed similar laws from say 1850 until after the American Civil War. And that's kind of how this developed then. So at first you got the ability to own your own property and then the ability to control it. Now, right here, really to celebrate the passage of that Property Act, some suffragists in New York State organized the very first women's rights convention in Seneca Falls, New York. So in 1848, and this was led by Lucretia Mott, who was a Quaker, very prominent in the abolition movement, and then Elizabeth Cady Stanton, whose family was also prominent reformers, had a long history of that in abolitionism and other issues. They were the leaders at the Seneca Falls Convention, which was attended by about 300 people. And of the various proposals or the resolutions that were passed by the convention, Stanton's suffrage resolution of proposed women's suffrage was the most controversial amongst both the men and the women in attendance. It was the only one that was passed without a unanimous approval. So that kind of shows you where people were, even in the reform community, on the topic of women's suffrage in 1848. Now, very quickly, Seneca Falls became a model for other people interested in suffrage. Fairly soon after, there was a state convention in the state of Ohio, which was the first statewide convention. And then in 1850, the first National Women's Rights Convention was organized in Worcester, Massachusetts. And at this one, the leading figure was Lucy Stone. And Lucy Stone was the first college graduate in the state of Massachusetts in the late 1840s. She was a brilliant orator, and she emerged as the most influential early suffragist. She was also a very prominent abolitionist. But she was really the leader of the movement as it was up until about 1870. And these conventions were read about and heard about in other countries, particularly Great Britain. And the British suffragists were inspired by this, and a very similar movement emerged in Great Britain in the 1850s, inspired by the American movement. And these national conventions then were held every year until the outbreak of the Civil War in 1861. Now, the most important duo in the history of women's suffrage was Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who we met earlier, and then Susan B. Anthony. And they met in 1851. Anthony was slightly younger than Stanton, but she also came from a Quaker background. She had been a school teacher and had managed a private school. But they were introduced in 1851. And they quickly became a really formidable team in both all kinds of reform issues, but suffrage being one of them, also abolitionism. And they were a great team because Elizabeth Cady Stanton was a married woman who had eventually 7 children, and she was oftentimes homebound, where Anthony was unmarried and had more freedom to move around. And so Anthony was a great organizer and a great speaker. And so she would organize meetings in towns all across the United States where she traveled to give speeches. And most of the time those speeches were written by Stanton, who was a really able writer and quite a philosopher, and was in some ways the philosophical leader of the early suffrage movement. Now we get to Iowa. Iowa was organized as a territory in 1838 and then admitted to the Union as the 29th state in December of 1846. Now, prior to becoming a state in 1846, the Iowa Territorial Legislature passed a married woman property law that was similar to the Mississippi law, where it allowed her to own her own property. It protected her from her husband's debts, but it left control of her property and management of it to her husband. And then after Iowa became a state in 1846, the legislature debated it some more, and in 1851 passed a law that granted married women control over their property. So Iowa kind of had a 2-step process. First, they modeled after the Mississippi law, and then they kind of brought it up to the level of the New York law. And so from 1851 on, married women could own and control their own property. You might notice we have a picture of the state capitol in Iowa City. Until 1858, Iowa City was Iowa's state capital. Now, Iowa has an interesting constitutional history in that it's actually had 3 different constitutions written for it, although only 2 of them have been adopted. Originally there was a constitution written in 1844 that was rejected by Iowa voters and actually delayed statehood by a couple of years because the voters at the time didn't like the boundaries that were proposed within the Constitution. And so then a new convention was put together, and in 1846 a new constitution was written that people accepted the boundaries, but it had some other problems that pretty much everybody knew were going to have to be dealt with at some point. And by the late 1850s, the 1846 Constitution was deemed unworkable, mostly because it prohibited things like banking in the state of Iowa. And so that led to the creation of a new constitution, which is our current constitution in 1857. But all three of these documents have one similarity in that they contained language that restricted suffrage to white males at least 21 years old. So Iowa's Constitution from the beginning had the word white and male in it under the suffrage section. So Iowa had a typically restrictive suffrage law, as pretty much every other state did. Now, interestingly enough, one of the very first suffragists, Amelia Bloomer, was an early Iowa resident. Bloomer was actually a native of Seneca Falls, New York, and had attended the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848. She was also a prominent prohibitionist, a member of the temperance movement that was interested in outlawing the sale and distribution of alcohol. And she started a newspaper called The Lily in 1848. That was the first newspaper in the United States written by and for women. And it became very influential in the suffrage movement, as well as basically the reform movement in general. And now Bloomer, her name, you probably know the name from bloomers, the type of pants or underwear. And here we have a picture of Amelia Bloomer in her bloomer suit. This was a particular style of dress that was designed in 1851 in response to Bloomer's call for a more practical outfit for women to wear. That was more they could do more strenuous types of activities that they needed to do that wasn't as restrictive. And it basically consisted of the bloomers were a kind of long flowy pants, loose-fitting pants that then were worn under a skirt or a dress and then topped by a coat. And so and this really became an early symbol. That dress, that outfit became an early symbol of the suffrage movement. And to some degree it became an object of ridicule eventually, to the point that Bloomer quit wearing the outfit. But that is where we get the name for that particular article of clothing. Now, Bloomer and her husband moved west beginning in 1853, and they eventually settled in Council Bluffs, Iowa in 1855. And by that point, she had sold the Lily newspaper to someone else, but she remained very active in the reform movement and in suffrage, and she was really the founder of the suffrage movement in Iowa, and she was the only Iowa woman to speak publicly on the issue of suffrage prior to the Civil War. Now, the kind of long, torturous history of women's suffrage in Iowa begins in 1866 on the legislative end we're talking about here. And it begins with the law proposed by Senator James Crookham of Oskaloosa in 1866. So remember, this is after the Civil War. The slaves have been freed in the South, and states, this is the period when the U.S. government is passing what are now called the Reconstruction Amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, and basically states were trying to align their state laws to conform with the new federal laws that were in the making. And so Crookham proposed extending the suffrage to certain persons of Iowa that have been heretofore excluded. And Crookham was most likely aiming at African American men because, remember, the state constitution had the word white in it. But it was broad enough that if that language had been used, it would have enfranchised women, arguably. And so that's generally pointed to as the first attempt to pass a law enfranchising women in the state of Iowa. Unfortunately, that wording didn't make it through the legislature, and eventually a bill that proposed to strike the word white from Article 2 of the Iowa State Constitution was passed, and it became law in 1868. And this is where we need to explain a little bit about the amendment process in Iowa. In Iowa, to amend the state constitution, the proposed resolution has to pass the state legislature on 2 occasions in 2 successive legislatures with the exact same wording. And in those days, and indeed until about 1969, the Iowa legislature met every other year. It didn't meet every year like it does today. And so, for instance, if a law was passed in 1866, then it had to then be passed in the same form by both houses in the next legislature, which would meet in 1868. And then after it passed both houses, it had to go to a state referendum of the voters of Iowa to be approved. And in all cases, all it took was a simple majority, so a 51% majority to pass. Now that we're up to 1866, we'll get an idea of what the city of Sioux City looked like. And you can see in this picture of Pearl Street looking north from 2nd Street. So 2nd Street would be approximately where the railroad tracks go through downtown Sioux City on Pearl Street. And you can see Sioux City in 1866 was very much a rough and tumble frontier town, kind of even a Wild West type town with dirt streets and wood buildings. This was before the arrival of the railroad, which didn't come until 1868. In 1866, Sioux City probably had 1,100 or 1,200 residents, so it was just a small frontier community at that point. So the next attempt to pass a suffrage law in Iowa came in 1870. And the 1870 Iowa General Assembly tended to be one of the more reformist in state history, particularly when it came to the status of women in Iowa. And so in 1870, a resolution to amend the Iowa Constitution by striking the word male from Article 2 was proposed by a guy named John Irish, who was a Democrat from Iowa City. And he'll come up in the story later because Irish started out his career as a suffragist, and then at some point in his career he turned into an anti-suffragist, and he'll come up later in our story. But the 1870 Iowa legislature was quite a reformist group, and Irish's suffrage resolution passed both houses in 1870. And it passed actually with fairly good majorities, 55 to 35 in the House and 32 to 11 in the Senate. That same session hired the first female clerk for the Iowa State Legislature. The House hired Mary E. Spencer of Clinton, Iowa, to serve as their clerk by a 96-0 vote. They also passed legislation that allowed both African Americans and women to practice law in the state of Iowa. They passed a law specifically granting married women control over their earnings, which was another step in raising the status of the legal status of women in the state of Iowa. So by 1870, Sioux City had actually gone through quite a transformation from where it had been in 1866. The railroad had been constructed to Sioux City in 1868, and you can see that in this photo of the Sioux City levee in 1870 running through the foreground. Of course, Sioux City was a steamboat port, and actually for a short time was the steamboat capital of the upper Missouri River. This was a place where goods could be shipped to Sioux City on the railroad, and then loaded onto steamboats and taken all the way to Fort Benton, Montana, where there were gold fields and other types of settlement. And so Sioux City had quite a lucrative trade between about 1870 and 1873 with that combination of steamboat traffic and railroad traffic. And as a result, Sioux City kind of experienced really its first major boom. And so it grew from about 1,300 people in 1868 to over 4,000 people in 1870, and so that's quite a bit of growth in a short period of time. Now, it was, of course, it remained a wild in some ways. It got wilder during this period. There were lots of saloons. I believe in the first city directory in 1871, there were something like 35 saloons in Sioux City, so it was well endowed with that. And here we have a picture of the north side of 2nd Street between Douglas and Pierce Street. We're at Douglas looking back to the west toward Pearl Street. And pretty much every building you see in this block is some type of either billiard hall or saloon. And so this is basically what the person coming in on the train or the steamboat to Sioux City would have seen at that time. And this is going to start the relationship between the suffrage movement and Prohibition in Iowa, in which they're tied together quite a bit, and that'll come up as we go along. Here we have another picture of Pearl Street. This time we're looking kind of to the northeast, actually, from about 2nd Street in 1869. And you can see there's some brick buildings now where there weren't in 1866, and also the residential areas have extended out into some of the hills surrounding downtown up to maybe 12th or 13th Street, which looks like that's way out in the country in this photo. But you can definitely see this is a period of pretty intense activity. Now, in 1870, I want to, as we go through this, kind of show where the representatives from Woodbury County in the state legislature stood on some of these issues. And I think maybe that will reflect what Woodbury County voters, and maybe specifically Sioux City voters, thought about those issues. And in 1870, the representatives of our area were in the Senate, Charles Atkins, who was a Republican from Ottawa, and in the Senate, and he voted no on the 1870 resolution. And then Constant Marks, who was from Sioux City, he was in the House, and he also voted no. So that kind of shows you that maybe in Woodbury County or in western Iowa there wasn't as much enthusiasm for women's suffrage as maybe there was in in some parts of eastern Iowa, and particularly in central Iowa. But the passage of that 1870 resolution certainly increased the hopes of suffragists in Iowa, and it led to the formation of what was at first called the Iowa Woman Suffrage Association, and then later called the Iowa Equal Suffrage Association, which was the leading suffrage organization in the state of Iowa. And through the passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920, the first president was Amelia Bloomer, and she served until 1873, and it included all of the early suffragists here in Iowa. So Bloomer, Annie Savory, Mary Darwin, and Maddie Griffith, who are prominent names in early Iowa suffrage history. Now, with Sioux City's kind of arrival as a fairly major city, or a major town anyway, in Iowa, came the first visits of national suffragists of national prominence. And so, because Iowa was considering this amendment to the state constitution, the national suffragists would come into Iowa and promote the passage of the bill in the subsequent legislature. And so the first prominent suffragist to visit Sioux City was Susan B. Anthony in 1871. And she spoke here on the 14th of June, 1871, at the Academy of Music, which had just opened in January of 1871. The Academy of Music was Sioux City's first big theater. It was an 800-seat theater on 4th Street between Pierce and Douglas Streets. And so she was one of the first big draws to that venue. And Anthony had a particular style where she would... she liked to read the local newspaper, figure out what's going on in town, and somehow relate her suffrage speech to what was going on in that particular locality, so people could relate to it. And so at that time, just before Anthony came, a group of wives in Sioux City had burned down a local brothel called Maple Grove that was owned by a madam named, her actual name was Dorothy Hampton, but she went by Madam Shaw. And it was located actually just outside of the picture we saw of 2nd Street earlier. It was on the north side of 2nd, just to the west of Douglas Streets, and I have it circled in this picture. It was kind of a sprawling place, and at this time, one of the things that women had against them was they had no easy recourse if their husbands were unfaithful or if they just abandoned the family. It was very hard to get a divorce, particularly for a woman, and so women were driven to desperate measures as Anthony. And so Anthony used this example in her speech and said how because women lacked legal standing, they were forced to take the law in their own hands and burn down this brothel that had drawn away their husbands, and probably they wasted their money, at it. And so she was showing the inherent unfairness of the laws as they were at that time. And that was taken, some people were offended by that example, but overall her visit was met with enthusiasm in Sioux City. So in 1872, the Iowa General Assembly again considered the suffrage resolution, and it passed the House 55-39, but in 1872 it failed in the Senate 22-24, and so that ended the first attempt to amend the Iowa Constitution to allow women's suffrage. And our representatives in 1872 were Charles Atkins, who was a Republican senator from Ottawa, and he did not vote. And you'll see this come up frequently as we come. It could be he just wasn't there on the day of the vote. I think sometimes they chose, instead of going on the record as voting for or against something, they just chose not to vote at all because they didn't want to take a stand. And so that may have been what Atkins was doing. The representative in the House was Amos R. Appleton of Sioux City, and he voted yes. He was a Republican from Sioux City, and he voted yes on the measure. So he was the first of our representatives to vote for women's suffrage at the State House. Now, on the national scene, shifting back to the national scene, in 1869, two Missouri suffragists, Francis and Virginia Minor, a husband-wife team, they argued that the newly passed 14th Amendment, which became law in 1868, implicitly enfranchised women. And there was a specific clause in the 14th Amendment that said, well, it still says, no state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States. And their argument was that voting was an inherent right of a citizen. If women were citizens of the United States, they had the right to vote, and they were being denied their rights if they were denied to do so. And so they therefore encouraged women to attempt to vote, and if they were denied, they wanted them to file lawsuits and work it out in court. And so I do want to go through here quick the suffrage or the Reconstruction amendments. The 13th Amendment, which was ratified in 1865, abolished slavery. The 14th Amendment, ratified in 1868, addressed citizenship and equal protection under the law. And it is one of the most adjudicated of the amendments, probably the most in American history. And there are a number of major Supreme Court decisions based on that. And then the 15th Amendment, which the suffragists hoped to be part of, passed in 1870, and it prohibited the denial of suffrage based on race. They had wanted it, the suffragists had hoped to be included in that by removing the word, they wanted to add the word race. They wanted to have it say race or sex. But that type of wording just couldn't get through the U.S. Congress, and the abolitionists and the Republicans that were in control at the time wanted to get this amendment through Congress, and so they dropped the reference to sex from it. And so the 15th Amendment enfranchised black men, but it left women out, all women out. Now, in practice, it was written so broadly and vaguely that black men in the South were largely prevented from voting until the 1960s through various state laws like poll taxes and literacy tests and things like that. And then through outright intimidation as well. But it was the first national law that tried to. It was the first national law that dealt with suffrage specifically. Otherwise, before that, it had always been up to the states. Now, Susan Anthony, as part of the new departure, tried to vote in the 1872 presidential election in her hometown in New York, and she was arrested and put on trial for violating the voting laws. And her trial was held in a circuit court under Judge Ward Hunt, who had recently been appointed to the U.S. Supreme Court and was on his way there. And in the trial, Hunt invoked a a precedent at the time that didn't allow someone accused of a felony in a federal court to testify in their own behalf. And so Anthony wasn't even allowed to testify until after she had been convicted. So Hunt directed the jury basically to convict her. And then she was allowed to speak afterwards. And she made a very eloquent speech about how her rights as an American citizen had been trampled at every level by the judicial system. But that set a precedent because at this time, voting was not considered to be an inherent right of citizenship in the United States or anywhere else for that matter. And that was seen as something special that could be limited. And in fact, if you want to argue the point, to this day, voting is still denied until you're a certain age. In our case, it's 18 today. In those days, it was 21. So there still are limitations on suffrage. But at that time, the American courts held that suffrage was not an inherent right of U.S. citizenship. And really the case that settled this matter once and for all was the Supreme Court case of Minor versus Happersett, where Virginia Minor, who was one of the originators of this, took her case to the U.S. Supreme Court in 1875, and they ruled that suffrage had never been a basic right of citizenship, and that the privileges or immunities clause in the 14th Amendment applied only to privileges or immunities explicitly outlined in the Constitution, which of course we know that that wasn't explicitly outlined. And so that basic conclusion was referred to through other types of restrictions into the 1960s, when the court started interpreting the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause to include voting as an inherent right of citizenship. But essentially, the 19th Amendment overturned in some ways part of this Minor versus Happersett ruling. But it was, as you can see, it was a 9-0 decision. So everyone on the Supreme Court was in agreement that minors' basic rights had not been violated. Now, the Iowa legislature immediately took up women's suffrage again in 1874 and then again in 1876. So in 1874, it passed both houses of the legislature. But then in 1876, it passed the House but failed in the Senate on two different votes. And you can see it was very close votes in the Senate, 22-24 and then 22-23. So it came very close to passing and then going on to a referendum in 1876. And in these years, our representatives here in Woodbury County were George D. Perkins, the editor of the Sioux City Journal, and Samuel B. Gilliand, who was a Republican from Akron. Perkins, serving in the Senate, he voted for women's suffrage in both. Actually, he voted 3 times in the Senate to affirm that, and Gilliand voted no both times he had a chance to vote on it. So I think I don't know how much to take from that, but Gilliand came from a rural area, and maybe there was some resistance to that. Although I think we'll see later that more of the resistance was in the bigger cities, oftentimes, than in the rural areas. Now, Susan B. Anthony came back to Sioux City in November of 1877 and again spoke at the Academy of Music. And here I have a picture of 4th Street in 1881. We're looking west on 4th Street from Nebraska Street. And you can see the Academy of Music in the distance. It has the Harry Hall sign on it in the distance where Anthony spoke. Sioux City continued to grow during the 1870s. It had nearly 8,000 people in 1880, so it was in a period of rapid growth and on the eve of even more rapid growth during the 1880s. And again, Anthony found something to talk about that happened here locally in 1877, and it happened to be Dorothy Hampton again. So right before Anthony came to Sioux City, she had been arrested and put on trial for keeping a house of ill fame. and it had gone to a grand jury, and the grand jury had found no reason to prosecute her, even though she was a very well-known madam in Sioux City. And that was a pretty typical attitude of male juries, all male juries in the 1870s. I have a picture here of the Sioux City riverfront in 1881, and you can see how the riverfront area had grown up during the 1870s. And of course, this is where, for instance, in the area where Dorothy Hampton's establishment would have been located. And so Anthony argued that she asked the audience, would a jury that contained women have found Hampton not guilty, essentially? And I think the answer probably would be that they would have found her guilty. And so again, she was using a Sioux City example of how women's lack of legal rights left them at a disadvantage. Now, at the national level, the first attempt to pass the bill that became the 19th Amendment in 1920 was introduced to the Senate in 1878 by Senator Aaron A. Sargent, a Republican from California who was a friend of Susan Anthony's, and it was eventually called the Susan B. Anthony Amendment. And so it was introduced to the Senate in 1878. It went to the Senate Committee on Privileges and Elections, and they decided that it should be indefinitely postponed. So it never even made it to a vote in the Senate in 1878. But it would be brought up at every session from that point until 1919. Now, this is where Prohibition starts to come into play. So Prohibition, the Women's Christian Temperance Union was formed in the early 1870s. And at this time, the temperance movement had gotten started in the 1820s, but it had grown along with the suffrage movement and along with abolitionism. And it was one of the major reform movements of the 1870s. And this is a time when Americans drank more than they do now, and a lot of the social ills, both real and perceived, were blamed on alcohol. And so there were a large number of Americans that wanted it outlawed in the United States. And in 1877, the Iowa Women's Christian Temperance Union voted to endorse suffrage, and that was that was actually a couple of years before the national organization started promoting women's suffrage. It started to once Frances Willard became head of the WCTU, but it didn't officially endorse suffrage until 1883 at the national level. And the reason for this was the temperance movement thought women would be more likely to vote for prohibition than not. And so if they could be enfranchised, prohibition laws, both at the state and federal levels, would have a much better chance of passing and sticking than if you just left it up to male voters. And so from this point on, suffrage and prohibition kind of went hand in hand for many people, and that worked both to the benefit and the hindrance of the movement, I would argue. Now, in Iowa, the 1880 and 1882 General Assemblies passed prohibition laws that would amend the state constitution to outlaw alcohol in the state of Iowa. And then it went to a statewide referendum in June of 1882 and passed with a 55% majority. So it should have become state law at that point, but a legal battle ensued, and in the case of Kaler and Lang versus Hill in 1883, the Iowa Supreme Court struck down the amendment because it had not passed with the exact same wording in both 1880 and 1882, and so therefore had not lived up to the stipulations of the Iowa Constitution. And so from that point on, Iowa's Constitution was never amended to have prohibition. They never tried to do that again. Now, at this very same time, the proposed women's suffrage amendment came up, and it passed the legislature in 1882, and then it in 1884, it passed the Senate, but it was voted to be indefinitely postponed in the House. So it never came to an actual vote in the House. And I can't help but believe that the whole Prohibition issue was not part of this, because men that may have leaned towards suffrage but didn't want Prohibition just probably were of the mind that suffrage could lead to Prohibition, and they didn't want to increase the likelihood of that. And so now I have some of our local state legislators to see where they came down on this. One is Gifford Robinson, was the senator. He was from Storm Lake, Iowa. In 1882, he voted yes for the suffrage amendment. Elbert H. Hubbard was a Republican member of the House from Sioux City, and he voted yes for it in 1882. And then in 1884, everything switched. So obviously it was a very different legislature in 1884. That year, Charles E. Whiting from Whiting, Iowa, a Democrat in the Senate, voted no. And Squire Haviland, a Democrat from Sioux City in the House, he voted to postpone. So in effect, he voted no as well. And so the local representatives kind of flipped their vote much as they did at the state level. Now, because the legislature had been thwarted in passing a constitutional amendment to have Prohibition, the 1884 legislature passed a state prohibition law. And under this law, Iowa was technically a dry state from 1884 to 1933, although it was pretty much systematically violated the whole time that it was in effect. It was strengthened in 1886 by a law that required district and county attorneys to enforce Prohibition. And I included a couple of drawings here of Sioux City had two breweries at this point, the Rudolph Seltzer Brewery and the Jacob Franz Sioux City Brewing Company. And so Sioux City was one of those Iowa cities that was not very favorable toward Prohibition really at any point in its history. Things took a step up on the Prohibition front in 1886 when Rev George Haddock, who was the minister at Sioux City's First Methodist Church, was murdered with a group of saloon people looking on at 4th and Water Streets, and he was a ardent prohibitionist who had been working to uncover evidence of local people violating the state prohibition law, in Sioux City, juries found the man who was tried for Haddock's murder, John Ehrensdorf. They failed to convict him twice. And in fact, in December of 1887, outright acquitted him of the murder of Reverend Haddock. And here we have a picture of Ehrensdorf with his jury after they found him not guilty. And so that kind of shows you, and I think this would have been, if Susan B. Anthony had been in town, this would have been an example of how having all male juries tended to circumvent the law in many cases.
I don't have a beard.
Exactly. Now, the Susan B. Anthony Amendment finally made it to a vote in 1887 in the U.S. Senate. But unfortunately, it suffered a lopsided defeat in the Senate. It lost 16-34, and it didn't get a vote in the U.S. Congress again until 1914. So it was a long, slow slog at the federal level for the Anthony Amendment. So by the late 1880s, Sioux City was in its most rapid period of growth. And this was the era of the Sioux City Corn Palaces. And so I have a picture here of a series of photos of Sioux City in 1889. By 1890, Sioux City had almost 40,000 people. It had become Iowa's second largest city. It was its leading industrial city. It was one of its leading railroad centers. And it really had become a major urban area in the state of Iowa. And so here we have a picture of the 1889 Sioux City Corn Palace. This was at the northeast corner of 6th and Pierce Streets. And then we have a series of views that were taken from that Corn Palace. This is a look to the southwest toward the Prospect Hill area in the southwest corner of downtown Sioux City. And you can see how that region had built up by that point, and looks, much, it's more developed then than it is today. Here we have a picture looking straight south, kind of straight down Pierce Street. You can see the large buildings that had been constructed in previous years. Another story to go along with the Prohibition side of things is, for a short time, all the saloons and breweries in Sioux City were closed, and the saloons simply moved across the Missouri River to the towns of Covington and Stanton, Nebraska, which is South Sioux City, and began operation there. And you can faintly see what was a floating bridge called the Pontoon Bridge across the Missouri River to the town of Stanton, and then Covington was to the west. And not long after this picture was taken, people from Covington burned down what was there of Stanton because they were in competition of who was going to be the city there. And so this was kind of a wild era when it came to development and to the Prohibition issue in particular. Here we have a picture looking to the southeast. Now we're looking toward you could see the Stockyards district in the far background to the southeast. You can see the working class neighborhood, eventually known as the Bottoms or the South Bottoms, in the kind of the mid range. And so by this point, the meat packing and stockyard industry had been established in Sioux City, and it was really on course for the way it would develop through the early 20th century. And here we have a picture to the north, how Sioux City's residential neighborhoods were expanding. And this is a view up Pierce Street. And so you can see the big houses that are being built along Pierce Street way into the north at this time. Sioux City's first suffragists were really the first ministers of Sioux City's first Unitarian church. The first minister at First Unitarian was the Reverend Mary A. Safford and her assistant Eleanor Gordon. And and then eventually Gordon's successor, Marie Jenny, and all three of these women were suffragists throughout their lives. Safford went on to be, Safford and Gordon both went on to be leaders of the Iowa Equal Suffrage Association after 1900, and Jenny eventually married and moved to Washington, D.C., but she remained active in the suffrage movement as well. And so really in Sioux City, these were the women that kind of started the things going here in Sioux City. Here's a picture of First Unitarian Church. So the church was formed in 1885, and they built this big church at the southeast corner of 10th and Douglas Streets in 1889. And so from 1889 on, there was much more of a formal suffrage movement in Sioux City, and it kind of coincided with the growth of women's clubs here in Sioux City. And women's clubs at this time were growing nationally as well. And so the first, actually one of the very first of these involved Carrie Chapman Cat, who was to become one of the very most important suffragists on the national scene. But she was from Charles City, Iowa, and as a young woman, she came to Sioux City in 1889 and helped organize the Sioux City Political Equality Club, and so which was the first suffrage organization here. And she would go on to lead the National Association or National American Woman Suffrage Association during two different periods, between 1900 and 1904 and 1915 to 1920. And she also, all through her time, she was interested in getting these women's clubs to support suffrage, because there was by no means unanimous amongst women. Interest in suffrage varied. And especially sometimes upper class women were interested in it at all because they already had influence in kind of indirect ways. And so a lot of these women's clubs started out as literary societies, or for instance, we have the Sioux City Athletic Club, which I believe developed out of the Big Sioux River boat clubs at the time. And they didn't initially start out as any type of political organization, but they eventually became civic improvement clubs, and they ended up being important to the suffrage movement as things went on, because eventually most of them ended up supporting women's suffrage prior to the passage of the 19th Amendment.